It got warmer towards evening, and a fresh snowfall covered the soot and dirt of the war. Bach was doing the rounds of the Frontline fortifications. The white snow of Christmas glittered in the flashes of gunfire, turning pink or green in the light of the signal flares. The stone ridges, the caves, the mounds of brick, the fresh hare tracks that covered the ground where people ate, relieved themselves, went in search of shells and cartridges, carried away their wounded, buried their dead. All this looked very strange in the brief flashes of light, and at the same time it looked all too familiar. Bach reached a spot that was covered by the Russian guns installed in the ruins of a 3-story building. He could hear the sound of a harmonica and their slow, wailing singing. Through a gap in the wall he could see the Soviet front line, the silhouettes of factories and the frozen Volga. Bach called out to the sentry, but his answer was drowned by a sudden explosion, followed by the drumming of clods of frozen earth against the wall. A low-flying Russian plane, its engine cut out, had just dropped a bomb. "Another lame Russian crow," said the sentry, pointing up at the dark winter sky. Bach squatted down, leaning his elbows on the familiar stone ledge, and looked round. A faint pink shadow trembled against the high wall. The Russians had lit their stove, and the chimney was now white hot. It seemed they had nothing to do all day except eat, 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 and slurp down huge mouthfuls of hot coffee. Further to the right, where the Russian and German trenches were closest together, he could hear the quiet, unhurried sound of metal striking frozen earth. Very slowly, and without ever coming up to the surface, the Russians were bringing their trench forward. This slow movement through the frozen, stony earth bore witness to a fierce, obtuse passion. It was as though the earth itself were advancing. That afternoon, Sergeant Eisenaug had reported that a grenade from a Russian trench had smashed the chimney pipe of the company stove and filled the dugout with dirt. Later on, a Russian soldier wearing a white sheepskin and a new fur hat had leapt out from his trench, cursing and shaking his fist. Realizing instinctively that this was a spontaneous act, none of the Germans had opened fire. "Hey! Chicken! Eggs! Russian glug-glug!" the soldier had shouted. The German had then jumped up and in a quiet voice that wouldn't be heard in the officer's trench called out, "Oi, Russian! Don't shoot! Must see mother again! You have Tommy gun! I have your hat!" The reply from the Russian trench had been curt and monosyllabic. Its sense had been unmistakable and had enraged the Germans. Still later, a hand grenade had exploded in the communication trench, but no one had been bothered by this. All this had been reported by Sergeant Eisenaug, and Bach had said, "Let them shout if that's what they want, as long as no one deserts." Eisenaug, his breath stinking of raw beetroot, had gone on to report that Private Pettenkoffer had somehow managed to do a deal with the enemy. Some Russian bread and lump sugar had been found in his knapsack. He had promised to exchange a friend's razor for a chunk of fat bacon and 2 packets of buckwheat. For this, he demanded a commission of 150 grams of fat bacon. "Well, it's simple enough," Bach had replied. "Order him to report to me at once." It had then emerged that Pettenkoffer had been killed that morning while carrying out a dangerous mission. "What do you expect me to do about it?" Bach had said in exasperation. "In any case, Russians and Germans have always been trading partners." Eisenaug, however, had been in no mood for pleasantries. He had been wounded in France in May 1940, and his wound still hadn't healed. He had then served in a police battalion in South Germany. He had been flown to Stalingrad only 2 months before. Hungry, frozen, eaten up by lice and by fear, he had lost whatever sense of humour he might once have had. It was over there, where he could just make out the lacework of ruined buildings, that Bach had begun his life in Stalingrad. The black September sky and its huge stars, the turbid waves of the Volga, the huge walls that were still hot from the fire, and then the steppes of the southeast, the frontier of Asia. The buildings to the west were buried in darkness. He could only make out the outlines of a few snow-covered ruins. Why had he written that letter to his mother from hospital? She'd almost certainly have shown it to Hubert. Why had he had those conversations with Leonard? Why did people have memories? It would be easier to die, anything to stop remembering. How could he have taken that moment of drunken folly for the deepest truth of his life? Why had he finally given in, after holding back for all those long, difficult years? He'd never killed a child. He had never arrested anyone, but he had broken the fragile dike that had protected the purity of his soul from the seething darkness around him. The blood of the camps and ghettos had gushed over him and carried him away. There was no longer any divide between him and the darkness. He himself was part of the darkness. What had happened to him? Was it folly, chance, or was it the deepest law of his soul? It was warm inside the bunker. A few of the soldiers were asleep, their bare yellow feet sticking out from under the overcoats they'd pulled up over their heads. The rest were sprawled on the floor. "Do you remember?" asked one particularly thin soldier, pulling his shirt across his chest and examining the seam with the fierce look characteristic of soldiers the world over as they inspect their shirts and underclothes. "Do you remember that wonderful cellar where we were quartered in September?" A second soldier, lying on his back, said, "You were already here when I joined you." "That was a splendid cellar," several other voices confirmed. "You can take our word for it. It was a real home, with proper beds." Some of the fellows were beginning to despair when we were outside Moscow. "Look what happened. We reached the Volga." Another soldier split a board with his bayonet and opened the door to the stove to throw in a few bits of wood. The flames lit up his large, grey, unshaven face, turning it a reddish copper. "A lot of good that's done us," he said. "We've swapped a hole near Moscow for an even worse hole near the Volga." A gay voice rang out from the dark corner where the soldiers' packs were piled. "Horsemeat! You couldn't think of a better Christmas dinner if you tried." The talk turned to food, and everyone grew more animated. First they discussed the best way of getting rid of the smell of sweat in boiled horsemeat. Some said you just needed to scoop the black scum off the top of the boiling water. Others said it was important to simmer the broth very gently. And still others said you should only use the meat from the hindquarters, put it straight into the boiling water while it was still frozen. "It's the scouts who have a really good time of it," said one young soldier. "They steal provisions from the Russians and then share them with their women in the cellars. And people wonder why the scouts always get off with the youngest and prettiest ones." "That's one thing I no longer think about," said the soldier, stoking the stove. "I don't know whether it's just my mood or not having anything to eat, but what I'd like to see is my children before I die, just for 1 hour. The officers think about it, though. I met the lieutenant himself in one of their cellars. He was quite at home, almost one of the family." "Well, what were you doing there?" "Well, I'd got to get my washing done." I was once a guard in a camp. I saw prisoners of war picking up bits of potato peel, fighting over a few rotten cabbage leaves. I said to myself, they're not human beings, they're beasts. And now we've become beasts ourselves." Suddenly the door was flung open. The mist swirled in and a loud ringing voice shouted, "On your feet! Attention!" These words of command sounded the same as ever, calm and unhurried. The men in the bunker made out the face of Lieutenant Bach through the mist. Then there was an unfamiliar squeak of boots, and they caught sight of the light blue greatcoat of the general in command of the division. He was screwing up his myopic eyes and wiping his monocle with a dirty piece of chamois. There was a gold wedding ring on his white hand. A voice, accustomed to ringing out over vast parade grounds, said, "Good evening! Stand at ease!" The soldiers answered in a ragged chorus. The general sat down on a crate. The yellow light from the stove flickered above the black iron cross on his chest. "I wish you a happy Christmas Eve," he said. The soldiers who were accompanying him dragged another crate up to the stove, prized open the lid with their bayonets, and began taking out tiny Christmas trees wrapped in cellophane. Each tree, only a few inches long, was decorated with gold tinsel, beads, and tiny fruit drops. The general watched as the soldiers unwrapped the cellophane, then beckoned the lieutenant towards him and mumbled a few words in his ear. The lieutenant announced in a loud voice, "The Lieutenant General would like you to know that this Christmas present from Germany was flown in by a pilot who was mortally wounded over Stalingrad itself. The plane landed in Pitomnik and he was found dead in the cabin." The soldiers were holding the trees in the palms of their hands. As they warmed up, a fine dew appeared on the needles, and the bunker was filled with the smell of resin. The usual smell of the front line, a cross between that of a morgue and that of a blacksmith's, was quite blotted out. To the soldiers, it was as if this smell of Christmas emanated from the grey-haired general sitting beside the stove. Bach felt the beauty and sadness of the moment. These men who defied the power of the Russian heavy artillery, these coarse, hardened soldiers who were dispirited by their lack of ammunition and tormented by vermin and hunger, had all understood at once that what they needed more than anything in the world was not bread, not bandages, not ammunition, but these tiny branches twinned with useless tinsel, these orphanage toys. The soldiers sat in a circle round the old man on the crate. Only that summer he had led the vanguard of the motorized infantry to the Volga. Everywhere, all his life, this man had been an actor. He had played a role not only in front of the soldiers or during conversations with the superior officer, but also when he was at home, when he was with his wife, his daughter-in-law, or his grandson, when he went for a walk in the garden. He had played a role when he lay alone in bed at night, his general's uniform spread out on the chair beside him. And of course, he'd been playing a role when he'd asked the soldiers about their mothers, when he'd made coarse jokes about their affairs with women, when he'd looked inside their cooking pots and tasted their soup with exaggerated seriousness, when he'd bowed his head austerely before still uncovered graves, when he'd given heartfelt fatherly speeches to the new recruits. And all this hadn't been a pose, been a part of his inner nature, infused into all his thoughts. He was quite unconscious of it. He could no more be separated from him than salt can be filtered out of seawater. It had been there as he entered the bunker, as he flung open his greatcoat, as he sat down on the crate in front of the stove, as he looked calmly and sorrowfully at the soldiers and wished them a happy Christmas Eve. But now, for the first time in his life, he became conscious of this theatricality. And just as salt crystallizes when water freezes, it deserted him, leaving him to his melancholy, to his sense of pity for these hungry, exhausted men. Now he was just a weak, helpless old man, sitting with a group of other men who were equally helpless, equally unhappy. One soldier quietly began to sing, "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum, wie grün sind deine Blätter." Two or three more voices joined in. The scent of pine needles was enough to make you feel dizzy. The words of the children's song were like fanfares of heavenly trumpets. "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum," out of the cold darkness of oblivion, as though from the depths of the sea, long dead thoughts and feelings rose slowly up to the surface. They brought no joy, no relief, but their strength was a human strength, the greatest strength in the world. One after another came the explosions of large-caliber Soviet shells. Ivan must have been annoyed about something. Perhaps he'd guessed that the besieged soldiers were celebrating Christmas. None of these soldiers, however, paid the least attention to the plaster falling from the ceiling, or to the clouds of red sparks belched out by the stove. Then there was a burst of furious metallic hammering. The earth seemed to be screaming, and that was Ivan playing with his beloved Katyushas. Then came a crackle of machine gun fire. The old man sat there with his head bowed. He looked like thousands of other men who have been exhausted by a long life. The footlights had faded. The actors had taken off their makeup and gone out into the grey light of day. Now they all looked the same. The legendary general, an insignificant corporal, even Private Schmidt, who had been suspected of harbouring dissident thoughts. Bach suddenly thought of Leonard. A man like him would never have surrendered to the charm of this moment. There was too much in him that was German, that was dedicated only to the state. Now it was too late for that to be made human. Bach looked up towards the door and caught sight of Leonard. Stumpfer, once the finest soldier in the company, a man of the new recruits had regarded with frightened admiration, was now unrecognisable. His large, blue-eyed face was thin and sunken. His uniform and greatcoat were just crumpled rags that barely kept out the wind and frost. He had lost his sharp intelligence, and his jokes no longer made anyone laugh. An enormous man with a vast appetite, he suffered more acutely from hunger than anyone else in the company. His constant hunger drove him out foraging early in the morning. He dug about in the ruins, begged, gathered up crumbs, hung around outside the kitchen. Bach had grown used to his tense, watchful face. Stumpfer thought about food incessantly. He searched for it even when they were fighting. As he made his way back to the bunker, Bach caught sight of the huge black back and shoulders of this eternally hungry soldier. He was digging in a patch of wasteland where the kitchens and supply depot had once stood. Here and there he found old cabbage leaves and tiny acorn-sized potatoes that had escaped the pot. Then an old woman appeared from behind a stone wall. She was very tall and wearing a ragged man's coat tied with a piece of string and a pair of down-at-heel hobnailed boots. She walked towards the soldier, staring down at the ground as she stirred around in the snow with a hook made from a thick piece of twisted wire. Their two shadows met on the snow. Otherwise they would have been unaware of each other's presence. Finally, the vast German looked up at the old woman, trustingly holding out a cabbage leaf that was stone-hard and full of holes. He said, slowly and solemnly, "Good day, madam." The old woman pushed back the piece of rag that had fallen forward onto her forehead. She looked at him with dark eyes that were full of kindness and intelligence, and said equally slowly and majestically, "Good day, sir." It was a summit meeting between the representatives of two great peoples. Bach was the only witness. The soldier and the old woman forgot the meeting immediately. As it grew warmer, big flakes of snow settled on the ground, on the red brick dust, on the crosses of graves, on the turrets of abandoned tanks, in the ears of dead men waiting to be buried. The snow filled the air with a soft grey-blue mist, softening the wind and gunfire, bringing the earth and sky together into one swaying blur. The snow fell on Bach's shoulders. It was as though flakes of silence were falling on the still Volga, on the dead city, on the skeletons of horses. It was snowing everywhere, on Earth, on the stars. The whole universe was full of snow. Everything was disappearing beneath it. Guns, the bodies of the dead, filthy dressings, rubble, scraps of twisted iron. This soft white snow settling over the carnage of the city was time itself. The present was turning into the past, and there was no future. Bach was lying on a bunk, behind a cotton curtain that screened off a small corner of the cellar. A woman was sleeping beside him, her head on his shoulder. Her face was very thin and looked somehow both childish and withered. Bach looked at her thin neck and at the outline of her breasts under her dirty grey blouse. Very gently, so as not to disturb her, he lifted an untidy tress of hair to his lips. It was springy and smelt of life and warmth. The woman opened her eyes. On the whole, she was a sensible, practical woman, At different moments, she could be tender, sly, patient, calculating, submissive, quick-tempered. Sometimes she seemed morose and stupid, as though something had broken her. Sometimes she sang arias from Faust and Carmen in Russian. Bach had never tried to find out what she had done before the war. He had come to see her when he felt like sleeping with her. Otherwise, he had never given her a thought. He had never worried about whether she had enough to eat, whether she might have been killed by a Russian sniper. Once he'd given her a biscuit he happened to find in his pocket. She had seemed grateful, and then offered the biscuit to her elderly neighbour. At the time, he'd been touched, but he had seldom remembered to bring her anything to eat. She had a strange, very un-European name, Zina. Until the war, Zina seemed not to have known the woman who lived with her. She was an unpleasant old woman, amazingly hypocritical, full of insincere flattery and obsessed with food. At this moment, with a wooden pestle and mortar, she was methodically grinding some mouldy grains of wheat that smelt of petrol. Until the encirclement, the Germans had quite ignored the Russian civilians. Now they visited their cellars frequently and got the old women to help with all kinds of tasks, washing clothes with cinders instead of soap, cooking up bits of garbage, darning uniforms. The most important people in the cellars were the old women, but the soldiers did call on the young women as well. Bach had always thought that no one knew of his visits to this cellar. One day, however, he had been sitting on the bunk, holding Zina's hand between his own, when he had suddenly heard German being spoken behind the curtain. A voice that seemed familiar was saying, No, don't go behind the curtain, that's Lieutenant Fräulein." They lay there side by side without saying a word. His friends, his books, his romance with Maria, his childhood, his ties with his birthplace, his school, his university, the Russian campaign itself, his whole life had become insignificant. All that was simply the path he had followed on his way to this bunk, fashioned from the remains of a charred door. The thought that he might lose this woman was appalling. He had found her. He had come to her. Everything that had happened in Germany, in the whole of Europe, had been merely a prelude to this meeting. Until now he had failed to understand this. He had often forgotten her. He had enjoyed seeing her simply because he had thought there was nothing serious between them, but now she was all that remained of the world. Everything else lay buried under the snow. There was only this wonderful face, these slightly dilated nostrils, these strange eyes, the tired, helpless, childish look on her face that drove him so crazy. In October she had visited him in hospital. She had found out where he was and had come all the way on foot, and he hadn't even got out of bed to see her. She knew he wasn't drunk, but he was on his knees, kissing her hands, kissing her feet, pressing his forehead and cheeks against her knees. He was talking quickly, passionately, but she couldn't understand. He knew she couldn't understand. She didn't know that terrible language of his. Soon the wave that had carried him to this woman would tear him away from her, would separate them forever. Still on his knees, he threw his arms around her legs and looked into her eyes, and she listened, trying to guess what he was saying, trying to understand what had happened to him. She had never seen such an expression on the face of a German. She had thought that only the eyes of a Russian could look so tender, so imploring, so mad, so full of suffering. He was telling her that here, in this cellar, as he kissed her feet, he had understood love for the first time. Not just from other people's words, but in his heart, in his blood. She was dearer to him than all his past, dearer to him than his mother, than Germany, than his future with Maria. He'd fallen in love with her. Great walls raised up by states, racist fury, the heavy artillery and its curtain of fire were all equally insignificant, equally powerless in the face of love. He gave thanks to fate for having allowed him to understand this before he died. She couldn't understand what he was saying. All she knew, all she'd ever heard was Halt, komm, bring, schneller, kaputt, Brot, Zucker. But she could see how moved he was. She could guess what he was feeling. The German officer's hungry, frivolous mistress sensed his helplessness and felt both tender and indulgent. She knew fate would separate them, and she was reconciled to this. But now, seeing his despair, she sensed that their liaison was developing into something unexpectedly deep and powerful. She could hear it in his voice. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he kissed her. As she played dreamily with his hair, she felt a sudden fear that this obscure force might seize hold of her too, might cause her to stumble, might be her ruin. Her heart was throbbing. It didn't want to listen to the cynical voice of warning. Yevgenia got to know a new circle of people from the prison queues. On seeing her, they would ask, "Well, any news yet?" By now she had become quite experienced. Instead of listening to advice, she gave it to others. "Don't worry, maybe he's in hospital. The conditions in hospital are very good. Everyone in the cells dreams of being sent there." She'd managed to find out that Krymov was in the Lubyanka. None of her parcels had been accepted, but she hadn't lost hope. At Kuznetsky Most, they would often refuse a parcel for the first time, even the second time, and then suddenly say, "Come on then, give us your parcel." Yevgenia went to Krymov's flat. A neighbour said that the house manager had come round 2 months before with 2 soldiers. They'd gone into Krymov's room, taken a lot of books and papers, put a seal on the door and left. Yevgenia looked at the wax seals and the bits of string. The neighbour, who was standing beside her, said, "But for the love of God, I never told you anything." Then, as she showed Yevgenia to the door, she plucked up courage and whispered, "What a fine man he was! He even volunteered to go to the front." Yevgenia didn't once write to Novikov. How confused she was. She felt pity, love, repentance, joy at the Russian victories, guilt about Novikov, anxiety on his behalf, fear that she would lose him forever, an aching feeling of having surrendered all her rights. Only a little while ago she'd been living in Kubyshev. She'd been about to go to the front to visit Novikov. The bond between them seemed as necessary, as inevitable as fate itself. Yevgenia had been horrified at the idea that she was bound to him forever, separated forever from Krymov. There had been moments when everything about Novikov had seemed alien to her. His hopes, his worries, his circle of friends had nothing whatsoever in common with hers. There was something absurd about the idea of her pouring out tea at his table, receiving his friends, talking to the wives of colonels and generals. She remembered Novikov's indifference towards Chekhov's The Bishop, and a boring story. He preferred the tendentious novels of a Dreiser or a Feuchtwanger. But now that she knew her separation from Novikov was final, she felt a surge of tenderness. She thought many times of his obedient readiness to agree with everything she said. And then she felt overwhelmed by grief. Would his hands never again touch her shoulders? Would she never really, ever see his face again? Never before had she met such an unusual combination of shy kindness and rough strength. She was so drawn to him. He was so free of harshness and fanaticism. There was such a special, wise, peasant kindness in him. But as soon as she thought of this, Yevgenia felt the presence of something dark and unclean. How had the NKVD found out what Krymov had said about Trotsky? Everything that tied her to Krymov was so desperately serious. It had been impossible to draw a line through their life together. She would follow Krymov. What did it matter if he didn't forgive her? She deserved his never-ending reproaches. She knew that he needed her, that in prison he thought of her all the time. Novikov would find the inner strength to get over their separation. But she had no idea what she needed for her own peace of mind. The knowledge that he no longer loved her, that he had calmly forgiven her, the knowledge that he was quite inconsolable, that he still loved her, and would never forgive her? And was it easier to believe they had separated forever, or to trust that one day they would be reunited? What suffering she'd caused everyone close to her. Could she really have done all this, not for other people, but for herself, to gratify her own whims? Was she just a neurotic intellectual? That evening, when they were all sitting at table, Yevgenia suddenly looked at her sister and asked, "Do you know what I am?" "You?" asked Ludmilla in surprise. "Yes, me," said Yevgenia. Then she explained, "I'm a small dog of female gender." "A bitch," said Nadia gaily. "Precisely," said Yevgenia. They all burst out laughing, though they knew very well that Yevgenia was not joking. "You know," said Yevgenia, "an admirer of mine in Kubishev, Limonov, once gave me a definition of middle-aged love. He said it was a spiritual vitamin deficiency. A man lives for a long time with his wife and develops a kind of spiritual hunger. He's like a cow deprived of salt, or an Arctic explorer who's gone without vegetables for years on end. A man with a forceful, strong-willed wife begins to long for a meek, gentle soul, someone timid and submissive." "This Limonov of yours sounds a fool," said Ludmilla. "What if a man needs several different vitamins, A, B, C, and D?" asked Nadia. Later, as they were about to go to bed, Victor said, "Zenevieva, we often make fun of intellectuals for their doubts, their split personalities, their Hamlet-like indecisiveness. When I was young, I despised that side of myself. Now, though, I've changed my mind. Humanity owes many great books and great discoveries to people who were indecisive and full of doubts. They've achieved at least as much as the simpletons who never hesitate. And when it comes to the crunch, they too are prepared to go to the stake. They stand just as firm under fire as the people who are always strong-willed and resolute." "Thank you, Vitenka," said Yevgenia. "Are you thinking of the small female dog?" "Precisely," said Victor. He wanted to say something that would please Yevgenia. "I was looking again at your painting, Zenechka. I like it because of the feeling in it. Avant-garde is nothing but novelty and audacity. There's no God in any of it." "You could say that again," said Ludmilla. "Green men, blue huts. It's totally cut off from reality." "Listen, Milka," said Yevgenia. "Matisse once said, 'If I use green, that doesn't mean I'm about to paint some grass. If I use blue, that doesn't mean I'm painting a sky. Colour is simply an expression of the inner world of the artist.'" Victor had wanted to please Yevgenia, but he couldn't help adding mockingly, "Eckermann, on the other hand, said, 'If Goethe were God, if he had created the world, he too would have made the grass green and the sky blue.' Those words mean a lot to me. After all, I'm not entirely a stranger to the material God formed the world from. Though, of course, I also know that there are no paints or colours, only atoms and the void between them." Such conversations were rare, however. Usually they talked either about the war or about the public prosecutor. It was a difficult time. Yevgenia's leave was coming to an end. Soon she'd have to return to Kubishov. She dreaded having to explain herself to her boss. She'd gone off to Moscow without saying a word. Day after day she'd hung around prisons and written petitions to the public prosecutor and the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs. Yevgenia had always been terrified of official institutions and of having to write official requests. Even the need to renew her passport had been enough to give her insomnia. Recently, though, her whole life seemed to have been made up of meetings with policemen, difficulties with passports and residence permits, statements and petitions addressed to the public prosecutor. There was a deathly calm in Ludmilla's house. Victor no longer went out to work. He just sat in his room for hours on end. Ludmilla came back from the special store looking angry and upset. The other wives no longer even said hello to her. Yevgenia was very conscious of Victor's nervousness. If the phone rang, he shuddered and rushed to pick up the receiver. While they were talking during meals, he often interrupted with a sudden, "Shh, shh, I think there's someone at the door." He'd go out into the hall and come back again with an embarrassed smile. The two sisters were well aware of the reason for this constant anxiety. "That's how you develop persecution mania," said Lyudmila. "The psychiatric hospitals were full of that in 1937. In view of Victor's constant apprehension, Yevgenia was particularly touched by the way he treated her. Once he even said, "Remember, Zenyevna, I don't care in the least what anyone thinks of the fact that someone living in my house is trying to help a person who's been arrested. Do you understand? You must look at this as your own home." Yevgenia enjoyed talking to Nadia in the evenings. "You're too clever for your own good," she said once. "You don't sound a bit like a young girl. You sound more like a member of a society for former political prisoners." "Future political prisoners," said Victor. "I suppose you talk politics with your lieutenant too." "And what of it?" asked Nadia. "You should stick to kissing," said Yevgenia. "That's what I was going to say myself," said Victor. "It's less dangerous." Nadia was drawn to dangerous subjects. One moment she'd suddenly ask about Bukharin. The next she'd ask whether it was true that Lenin had thought highly of Trotsky and hadn't wanted to see Stalin during the last months of his life. Had he really written a testament that Stalin had kept secret? When they were alone together, Yevgenia avoided asking Nadia about Lieutenant Lomov. Nevertheless, she soon knew more about him and Nadia's relationship with him than Lyudmila did. From listening to Nadia talk about politics, about the war, about conversations she'd had with her friends, about the poetry of Mandelstam and Akhmatova. Lomov was obviously sharp-witted and difficult. His attitude towards everything, generally accepted, was one of cynicism. He wrote poetry himself. It was from him that Nadia had learnt her indifference towards Sholokhov and Nikolai Ostrovsky, and her contempt for Demyan Biedny and Tvardovsky. And Nadia was obviously parroting him when she said with a shrug of the shoulders, "Revolutionaries are either stupid or dishonest. How can one sacrifice the life of a whole generation for some imaginary future happiness?" Once Nadia said to Evgenia, "Why is it that the older generation always has to believe in something? Krimov believes in Lenin and communism, Papa believes in freedom, Grandmother believes in the people and the workers. But to us, the younger generation, all that just seems stupid. It's stupid to believe in things. One should live without beliefs." "The lieutenant's philosophy?" Yevgenia interrupted. She was taken aback by Nadia's answer. "In 3 weeks, he'll be at the front. There's philosophy for you. Alive today, dead tomorrow." Talking to Nadia, Yevgenia often remembered Stalingrad. Vera had also talked to her. Vera had also fallen in love. But what a difference between her, the clear simplicity of Vera's feelings, and the confusion of Nadia's. And how her own life had changed. What a difference between her view of the war then and her view of it now, in these days of victory. Nevertheless, the war went on, and what Nadia had said was still true. Alive today, dead tomorrow. What did the war care whether a lieutenant played the guitar and sang, whether he believed in the bright future of communism and volunteered for work on the great construction sites, or whether he read the poetry of Anensky and had no faith whatsoever in the imaginary happiness of future generations? Once Nadia showed Yevgenia a handwritten copy of a song written in one of the camps. It was about the freezing holds of the transport ships, the roar of the ocean, the way the Zeks, suffering from seasickness, embraced like blood brothers, and how Magadan, the capital of Kolyma, rose up out of the mist. When they first got back to Moscow, Victor had lost his temper if Nadia so much as mentioned these subjects. Now, however, he had changed completely. Unable to restrain himself, he'd complain in Nadia's presence how impossible it was to read these unctuous letters addressed to the great teacher, the best friend of all gymnasts, the wise father, the powerful Coryphaeus, the brilliant genius, a man who, in addition to all this, was kind, compassionate, and modest. began to seem as though Stalin himself ploughed fields, forged metal, fed babies in their cradles, and handled the machine gun, while the workers, students and scientists, did nothing but pray for him. But for Stalin, a whole great nation would have perished long ago like helpless cattle. One day Victor counted 86 mentions of Stalin's name in one issue of Pravda. The following day he counted 18 mentions in one editorial. He railed against the illegal arrests, the absence of freedom, and the way semi-literate party members had the right to give orders to scientists and writers to correct them and tick them off. Something had indeed changed in Victor. His growing horror at the destructive fury of the state, his increasing isolation and helplessness, his sense of doom, all this sometimes engendered fits of recklessness, a contempt for the dictates of prudence. One morning Victor ran into Lyudmila's room. She felt quite taken aback by his unaccustomed look of excitement and joy. "Lyuda, Xenia, I've just heard on the radio. We've set foot once more in the Ukraine." That afternoon, when Yevgenia came back from Kuznetsky Most, Victor saw the expression on her face and asked, just as Lyudmila had asked him in the morning, "What's happened?" "They've taken my parcel! They've taken my parcel!" said Yevgenia. Even Lyudmila could understand how much a parcel from Yevgenia would mean to Krimov. "A resurrection from the dead," she said, and added, "I think you really must still love him. I've never seen you with eyes like that before." "Probably I'm really mad," Yevgenia whispered to her sister. "I'm happy to be, because Nikolai will get my parcel, and secondly, because I've realized today that there's absolutely no question of Novikov having informed. Do you understand?" "You're not just mad," said Lyudmila angrily. "You're worse than mad." "Victor, darling, do play us something on the piano," said Yevgenia. Victor hadn't sat down at the piano for a long time, but now instead of making excuses, he fetched some music, showed it to Yevgenia and asked, "Is that all right?" Lyudmila and Nadia both disliked music. They went out into the kitchen. Victor began and Yevgenia listened. He played for a long time, and when he'd finished, he just sat there without saying a word or even looking at Yevgenia. And then he began another piece. There were moments when Yevgenia had the impression that Victor was sobbing, but she couldn't see his face. Suddenly Nadia flung open the door and shouted, "Turn on the radio! That's an order!" The music stopped and was replaced by the metallic roar of Levitan's voice. At that moment he was announcing, "The town was taken by storm, together with an important railway junction." Then he listed the generals and units which had distinguished themselves in combat, beginning with General Tolbukin. Suddenly he said in an exultant voice, "And also the tank corps commanded by Colonel Novikov." Yevgenia gave a quiet sigh. Then as the announcer went on in his powerful, measured voice, "Eternal glory to the heroes who have died for the freedom and independence of the motherland." She began to cry.